So before becoming an assistant professor at Western Kentucky University, I actually worked for the University of Tennessee. I was the associate director of the Center for Athletic Field Safety. I worked for Dr. John Sorokin. I'm sure all of y'all have at least heard him speak or know him, or if you've had the opportunity to drink beer with him and felt really bad the next morning. He's a great person. Of course, we have this wonderful research facility there. So lots of sports turf, very specific research going on there, and everything from synthetic turf to natural grass to hybrids. I mean, you name it, the University of Tennessee is doing it. And this is the Center for Athletic Field Safety. You've probably, if you've seen Dr. Sorokin speak or one of the other guys from UT, you've probably seen a photo similar to this. This is our research farm out there. So you can see we've got a nice mix of warm season, cool season grasses, as well as synthetic athletic fields. Now, the whole premise of this facility was to try to assist synthetic fields to be more like natural grass. Now, it's undeniable that in terms of all our safety parameters, everything that we measure, a pristine, perfect natural grass field will outperform a synthetic field hands down 100% of the time. Now, the issues start coming in, at least from the natural grass side, is as they wear, they may lose some of that edge. But still, there's a safety component. So that's really the focus here, was trying to help push synthetic turf to be a little bit safer, to be a little bit more like natural grass. Of course, it's hard to compete with Mother Nature, right? The best stuff in the world was created natural. So one of the big misconceptions, and it's getting less and less and less, is that synthetic turf is maintenance free, right? So you put the field out there, kids can just play and play and play and play, and then it's going to be in for a decade or so, and we're never really going to have to touch it. And unfortunately, that's been the sales pitch historically for synthetic turf. Now, all of us in this room, anybody that's dealt with synthetic turf, understand that is not the case. There's actually some maintenance involved. One of the big things of performing maintenance is that it can actually increase the longevity of your field. So if you do the things properly, you brush it, you maintain infill levels, you rotate traffic, you do those sorts of things, you can actually get maybe a year or two more out of your field and stay within good performance. Now, obviously, we could let a field go well beyond its max life or what its warranty life is, but at some point there's going to be a tapering off of the performance of that surface. Fibers are going to start breaking down and wearing. Backing is going to start breaking down and wearing, and you're going to end up with some areas that aren't really safe. Poor footing, maybe a very hard surface to land on, those sorts of things. So, but by maintaining and doing some of those maintenance aspects, we can try to make them last a little bit longer. We can make sure that their performance and the safety of that surface, by doing maintenance, stays the same throughout the life. Now, there's a big push in Europe that those fields will have a testing regime already built into the cost of the field, and it'll help maintain that surface as the way it was when you first bought it. And then, of course, performing maintenance is part of your warranty requirement. So if you end up having an issue, and hopefully if you have a synthetic field, you never have one of these issues, but if you do, performing maintenance will actually help maintain that warranty and will help later on. So if lawyers get involved, you've done the things that you're supposed to have done. So what we did at UT, we had this question. When should we do maintenance? How much maintenance do we need? What happens if we actually perform maintenance? And the other question was, well, we've got all these new alternative infills, things different from crumb rubber. How do they perform? So if we start trafficking and wearing them, how are they going to perform? How much maintenance do they really require? Are they different from crumb rubber? So those were some of the questions that we were trying to answer here. So we basically applied 10 simulated football games a week. We had split plots, so we had a big long strip of turf. One half of it was brushed, one half of it was not. So one half got nothing, absolutely nothing. The other half was brushed. Infill was replaced as necessary. we really tried to maintain it as best we could. And you can see at the bottom here that we've got the actual surfaces that we tested, and we kept it very generic, but we had everything from 1.25 inch pile height, so very fine, very short synthetic turf, all the way up to, and of course here it says 2 inch, but we actually had a 2.5 incher in there as well. So we had the range. We also had a variety of shock pads in there, because part of that question was, well, does the shock pad actually affect how much maintenance is required? And then we had different infills. So of course we had the standard crumb rubber, which is, we call SBR, ground up car tires. We had a cork coconut product. We had a recycled rubber product. And we kind of ran those all through to see how much splash occurs, how much infill we have to replace, that sort of thing. So here's the products that we had. We had recycled rubber. Basically, if you're wearing tennis shoes, it was the bottom, the sole of the shoe ground up, and that was used as an infill. And it was very colorful, looked pretty in the turf, I guess. That's what my 5-year-old daughter thought. Then we had a cork coconut fiber, and then we also had our standard crumb rubber. So just, some typical things that are out there on the market. We simulated traffic. If you haven't seen this, this is our traffic simulator. It's an air fryer with some feet put on it. And hopefully I can get the video to play. Okay, it goes on for a while, sorry. That's what our trafficker does. So one pass of that is equivalent to an NFL football game between the hashes from 40-yard line to 40-yard line. So the number of cleat marks that does in one pass is what that equates to. And you could see in that video how much of the infield's bouncing around and moving. So we did basically 10 games a week before we'd ever think about doing maintenance. So here's what our turfs looked like at the end of 120 games. So we can see, so that's 120 games. This one's 120 games. This one is 120 games. And this carpet right here, the actual 120 games is right here in the middle. And we'll talk about, that's a secret that we're going to talk about a little bit later. So that one wasn't necessarily in this study, but 120 games, and it looks very different from the rest of them. We did E-missile drop. So this would be the F355 A. This was taken at the field that was installed in Bristol for the UT Virginia Tech game. So basically we got a hemispherical missile that we drop on the surface, and very similar to a Clegg, it measures surface hardness. The only difference, this one, we actually integrate that curve and come up with a head injury criteria. So that was one of the tests that we performed. And when we look at it, it really doesn't look like maintenance did a whole lot, or no maintenance did a whole lot, right? So this is average over 2 drop heights. So it really wasn't too big of a difference. Especially our 1.25 inch down here. I mean, they were virtually the same. Now, part of this is because of those underlayments, those shock pads that we had under there. That 1.5 inch or 1.25 inch 80 ounce had a very high-end shock pad underneath it. So basically, with that shock pad, if I was concerned with head injury criteria and was afraid that I wasn't going to do a whole lot of maintenance, with that shock pad, I knew we could pass the head injury criteria requirements. This 2.5 inch 30 ounce with SBR doesn't have a shock pad underneath it. There still wasn't a whole lot of difference there, and that's because there's so much infill in that 2.5 inch. So there's a lot of rubber already built in there, so it's kind of like it's got its own shock pad built in. So even after we lost a ton of rubber, which you'll see, there's still plenty there that could actually protect the player's head. And then some of these other ones, you can see a little bit bigger of a discrepancy. The recycled rubber moved a little bit. The cork coconut fiber broke down, moved a little bit, and then the SBR right here moved a little bit. And what's interesting between these two, and you can see a pretty big difference, is just the shock pad. So it's the same carpet, same exact infill. The only difference was the shock pad underneath. And you can see that one actually basically required a little more maintenance than the other. So if we look at the drop height effect alone, we can see that really at 0.6 meters, there wasn't a whole lot of impact the maintenance had on it. And that was kind of problematic. So if we dropped it from about here, there's really no effect whether you did maintenance or no maintenance. And you're dropping from such a small height that really it's not going to be that hard. When you looked at the 1.3 meter drop, that's where we started seeing some big discrepancies between maintenance and no maintenance. And you could see some big discrepancies just among systems here, with a high-end shock pad here, no shock pad there. The rest of these all had some type of shock pad in them, so there's some sort of protection to the actual player. And then you could see this is just tracking the average head injury criteria over time. So you could see that by applying traffic, we actually did affect head injury criteria. It just didn't have that big an effect on head injury criteria. So, and this is that high-end shock pad down here. That's why it's so far down below. So those head injury criteria numbers are much, much lower there. One of the other things we did is, and this is a standard test on synthetic turf, is the F355 A missile. It's a heavier missile, and it's actually flat on one surface. So this guy is actually in the specs with ASTM to test synthetic turf fields. This is the standard. The E missile is something that had been looked at as being added to ASTM, and there's some big arguments there, but it's something that folks like World Rugby kind of require. It's commonly used on playgrounds. So this is definitely being used on synthetic turf, and there's actual standards built in for this. So this is where we really started seeing big differences between maintenance and no maintenance. So if you perform maintenance, and maintenance, what we're talking about here is brushing. We had graduate students out there with push brooms if we needed it. We had a power broom if we needed it. We would measure infill levels. So after it was brushed in, we would measure the infill levels. And then if it was low, below the manufacturer's minimum recommended amount, then we would actually come in and add more back to it. So that was maintenance. The other side had zilch. So if infill walked off, so be it. If fibers were bent over and trapped, so be it. So you can start to see a big difference here between no maintenance and maintenance. Right? So what's really interesting, though, is that even without any maintenance, they still actually can all pass the ASTM standard. So according to ASTM, they're all safe, even though after 120 equivalent to 120 NFL football games and no maintenance was absolutely performed, they can still pass the surface hardness test. So on average, we looked at about 20 G's harder. So, and then what else we found is that non-maintenance plots had greater deviation. So we measured multiple spots within that plot. And we did it on maintenance, no maintenance. On maintenance, we kept that really tight. So we're looking at like 3.2 G's. We kept it really, really close. So if we moved over a couple feet here or there, it might vary just by 3 G's either way. When we did no maintenance, because you'd have some areas with a lot of infill piled up, some areas without much infill piled up, the variation became 8 G. So that's almost to the point, and we haven't studied this, but it'd be curious to know, at what point on this deviation would an athlete be able to feel underfoot an area that's softer or harder? Now, this could actually lead, a softer area versus a harder area could actually lead to some type of injury and be interesting to test. It did show with our A missile that every surface that we tested did require maintenance to some degree. So even those that had the real fancy shock pad changed when no maintenance was applied. And so really, to keep it performing well, you should apply maintenance. So this is our infill depth. Now, one of the things we tracked over time was our infill, right? Because that was very important for our maintenance side. That was one of the premises, that if we can maintain infill in there, we can maintain fiber integrity. We can also maintain performance characteristics. So we tracked it over time. And you could see that basically there's a little bit of drop on both of them. Now, part of that is because these were brand new installed turf. And there's some settling that's going to occur after it's initially installed. So we saw a decrease, and then we were actually pretty good. The graduate students were pretty good at keeping our infill levels very consistent on our maintenance side. They weren't so good, at least in 80 games, of measuring infill depth and not hitting the big piles that were everywhere. So we would randomize it. They would go out and hit some spots, and we had a guy that kind of was picking out humps, and I don't know what he was doing, but so it's, we do have coefficient uniformity with that. So yeah, I can get that to you later. I don't have it here with me. And so one of the other things we were trying to figure out was how much time did we get to before we had to actually add back in some of the infill material. So with our recycled rubber, we started at game 60. So up until game 60, we were able of brushing it back in, it would maintain that infill depth level. From game 60 on, we started seeing that we needed to add a little bit of material back every time we perform maintenance. With our coconut fiber cork, it basically started at game 20. So every 20 games we were adding infill. At game 20, we started adding infill with the coconut fiber and cork. And not all of that was related to so much the traffic. And then our crumb rubber, it really started at 40 games. And we basically continued that throughout the duration. So you might be looking at, well, so they're both rubber, right? So why the discrepancy? Why did this one take a little bit longer? Well, not 100% sure, but when you look at the particle size, the recycled rubber is a little bit smaller than crumb rubber and a little more sharper, kind of more angular, and it looks like they would lock in together a little bit. So that's what we think, but can't be 100% sure. Two, there's differences in how soft the rubber is itself. So you apply traffic onto a synthetic turf field, it does require maintenance, and it does result in a lost infill. And we all know that. If you've ever played on a synthetic turf field, if you worked on one, you know when you go home and take your shoes off, there's infill that goes with it. So track that over time with a bunch more feet, and there's just a little bit of infill that's leaving, but there's more as it's migrating out, depending on play and maintenance, that sort of thing. We also did a fiber reveal, and we thought, well, one of the key things is how much fiber is actually exposed. Now, if we start talking about things like cleat lock, the more fiber that's exposed above your infill depth, the more likely cleats are going to lock in that surface, and you're not going to be able to move your foot, and that's going to result, or could result, in a high ankle sprain or some type of knee injury. So we thought we'll use this prism gauge, and we'll set the thing down, and we'll look and see how much fiber is sticking up above the infill depth. So not only will we know the infill depth, but we'll know how much fiber is exposed. We could have easily done the math too, because we know the pile height and that sort of thing. But what was interesting is that we didn't really see what we wanted to see. The 1.25 inches, and I'm not showing you the data because it had actual company logos on it, and I didn't want to bring that up, but 1.25 inches actually had the most fiber exposed. The 2.5 inch had the least fiber exposed. The big difference was that the 1.25 inch, the fibers stood straight up. Very short fibers, they stood straight up. The 2.5 inch fibers were bent over sideways. So as we applied traffic and infill left, our machine kept mashing down. Eventually they were bent over sideways, so when you lay that prism gauge on there, there'd be very little fiber actually sticking up. Now, if you went to STC back in 2016, we got to listen to Dr. Kent do a talk, and he was using his BEAST apparatus. Anybody familiar with this BEAST apparatus? So he tested the NFL shoes. It puts about, I think, 1,100 pounds of pressure down on a foot, on a shoe, and then tries to twist it. And basically he's looking at time to release. So how long does it take for that surface to give and allow that cleat to move? And it was kind of a measurement of the cleat. So is this cleat more or less likely to cause an injury? And he would do that to recommend to NFL players to, if I were you, I wouldn't wear this cleat. Well, what he found was, and it was really neat, is that if you just reduced infill depth by 4 millimeters, that was enough to cause from a shoe to go from being able to release to now it's actually locked and won't release. Well, 4 millimeters, that's like the size of one row of crumb rubber, right? So it just confirms that you have to do some sort of maintenance. You need to maintain those infill depth levels. And so these are kind of what you would see with some of our surfaces. This was the recycled rubber surface. Here I'm showing you the cork coconut fiber. Now here was the problem with the cork coconut fiber. It wasn't so much that it wouldn't hold up to the traffic. It did break down a little bit as we applied traffic to it. And in organic material, you would expect something like that. But the big issue, and some of y'all I'm sure have experienced this, is every time it rained, the arrow at the top up there is where the plot was that had the cork coconut fiber, and yet I kept finding it down in this puddle. So in a way, it wasn't a real fair comparison to the cork coconut fiber when I say, well, I had to add it every 20 games. I may not, but I can't harvest it out of the gravel here and get it all the way back there. If it was in one continuous field and the rain moved it over a little bit, then I may have the opportunity to brush it back in. So unfortunately, it wasn't real fair to the cork coconut fiber. And there are a lot of benefits to cork coconut fiber. And I don't want to detract from it. I'm being completely honest that it really wasn't fair for it. It kept moving. Our drain lines kept moving. We have a nice slope there. East Tennessee, we get lots of rain. We had some pretty good gully washers. If you're from the South, you're familiar with that term. And then some of the other products that we had out there that weren't part of this testing, but were things that we looked at along the way. So we had a zeolite product. It didn't really move a whole lot. It did get a little dusty over time as we traffic it. We really didn't measure how much we lost. We had a TPE product that had some drawbacks to it, and then we had this fine mesh recycled rubber. So here's the zeolite, and actually you can see that some of that recycled rubber had migrated into it, but did a really good job of staying in place. It passed all the performance characteristics, so if we did head injury criteria, if we measured with the A missile, it would pass all those things, and part of that's because it had a very high-end shock pad underneath it, but I don't know, me personally, I don't know how happy I'd be about sliding on it. It's gravel, well, very small gravel. And then this is the TPE, so it was a virgin plastic, basically. The unfortunate side of it was completely round. All the particles were the exact same size, and they were all round, and it would not stay in place for anything. Like you couldn't walk across it without splash occurring. So impact characteristics, it did great. Head injury criteria, it did great. Its really big drawback was that you could not walk without it actually splashing. And so if you ran, if you slid, if you just drug your hand over it, half the infield flipped up in the air and moved somewhere else. So performance characteristics good. The fact that it's virgin material, you don't have to worry about anything being in it that could be harmful. It has some benefits there, but it moves too much. If I were looking at a TPE, one of the things I would be considerate of is look at the particle size and shape. So you want things that aren't round. You want them somewhat angular. There are several companies that make things that look like X's and various configurations to help keep that from happening. And then we have the fine mesh recycled rubber. See, the original recycled rubber that we had was relatively close to the size of a typical crumb rubber that we would use. This is very, very fine. You can see the size of the leaf blades of the synthetic turf to the size of the actual particles. And this was, had it been included in the maintenance study, this would have been the champ. This was that one I showed you at the beginning. That's 120 games, and all of it that we started with is still there. So from day 0 to 120 games later, it didn't go anywhere. It would bounce up a little bit. It would stay on top of the leaves. We get rain, washed right back down where it was. It never tracked off with the trafficker. The first few days of it, it was a little bit sticky with static electricity, but it adhered to the turf. I mean, it basically never went anywhere. So it works really well, passes all the performance characteristics. A really great product with one big exception. It is extremely expensive. Extremely expensive. So it's expensive enough to recycle the soles of shoes and turn that into infill material, having to separate all those particles. But then it requires a bunch of extra grinding to get it to this actual size. So a lot of grinding, a lot of screening of the product, so it makes that price much, much higher. But as far as performance goes, it works really, really well. Now, some of you might be sitting there going, well, gosh, a particle size that small, shouldn't I be concerned about infiltration? No, absolutely not. We had this product. We had no issues with infiltration on it. And honestly, infiltration on a lot of these synthetic systems at the beginning is solely dependent on the hole spacing, the size of the holes in the backing of the turf. Because you're putting a sand ballast down, right? So you got a sand that's slightly larger than what the particle size of the recycled rubber here is. But we're layering there. If the sand gets in the holes, maybe it'll slow it down. But really, it's the backing on the turf that's the problem. And it was a big concern with the synthetic companies that too small particle size is going to end up clogging up their drainage holes in the backing and actually slow down infiltration. We never saw any of that. So here's the $1 million question, or I guess questions. What type of maintenance should I do? How much maintenance should I do? Right? So that's the one that everybody wants to know. Well, this is my legal disclaimer right here from everything going forward is that I'm going to suggest that you ask your installer or manufacturer. Okay? So in case any of y'all are thinking I'll do this and sue you later, it's not. I've got a disclaimer here. But no, in all honesty, do what your manufacturer, your installer tells you to do. They should give you some sort of guide to maintaining that synthetic turf, and you should follow that like it's the Bible, right? So you should go through page by page, understand 100% of it, follow 100% of it, because we want to make sure that we stay within our legal bounds and you don't void a warranty or anything like that. But there's some things that we could typically do. Routine maintenance. One of the most important things that you can do is walk your surface. Right? So when we were out testing the fields for the Tennessee-Virginia Tech game at Bristol Motor Speedway, right? Brand new field, and they're putting up all this crazy stuff. They had like the biggest TV ever hoisted in the air. And so we're out there testing, and when you looked at the video, I was one of the fat guys out there testing. But so we're doing all that testing. Dr. Sorokin, because he has all of his minions doing all the testing, he was free to walk around and stuff. And so he's cruising along, and he ends up finding a arc welding rod laying out on about the 50-yard line where they'd been welding all the framework for this giant TV that was up in the air. So there's a good chance something like that could have slipped through the cracks, and next thing you know, a UT player or a Virginia Tech player could end up getting seriously injured with something like that. So something as simple just walking your field. You know from football, I know personally that you get on your mower after the game and all you hear is ding, 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 right? Everything from buckles and snaps to quarters and nickels and keys. I've hit all sorts of stuff. And so those same things are falling out and falling off and getting in that synthetic surface. The big difference is that you're not going out there mowing and your mower hitting it all, or you're not able to press it into the ground, right? It can't get smashed into the dirt. It's going to stay there right on the surface. So very important that you go out and just walk your field every day. If you see stuff, remove it. One thing I would recommend is to check your infill depths regularly, religiously. Because out of all the maintenance studies that we've done, everything that we looked at, that seemed to be by far the most important thing. If you maintain your infill depth, you're going to maintain the safety of that surface, as safe as it was to begin with, and you're going to protect the fiber of that surface and help lengthen the time that you have that field. Another important thing is to actually keep a log. Every time you do all that thing, write it down. And that's just something that any lawyer would tell you is write stuff down, keep track of it. So just in case, write it down. I brushed this day, we went this many directions, whatever. And that way you can keep track of all the maintenance that you do. And of course, it's like managing natural grass, right? You keep track of how much fertilizer and pesticide and stuff like that. You should keep track of taking care of your synthetic turf. Well, it depends on the manufacturer, of course. It depends on the surface. And from what we found, it depends on the infill and shock pad combination. So shock pads that are really, really soft actually require more brushing than those that aren't. And because of that, there's a lot more energy getting reflected back up to that surface, and it's bouncing out more infill. So you get some unevenness of your infill depth. So I think a lot of manufacturers, it's like around 80 hours of use. We went every 20 games, so we say each game's an hour. That's 20 hours of use. And to be honest with you, that wasn't enough. Well, it's funny that you ask. Thank you. So this is from ASTM's actual publication about test points that they recommend. Okay, so here's where they would recommend, and statistically based on the usage areas, stuff like that, this is where they recommend to get you a pretty good idea of what your surface is. So kind of some key areas to measure. Of course, the middle of the field, the sidelines are pretty important. Fortunately, you got number 6 in here. With NFL, it's moved the PAT back, right? With college and stuff, you're looking at around in there. So it gives you a pretty good idea of where you need to check there. And of course, anywhere that you have high use. So if you get walk on, walk off, very important to check those and maintain those. Perfect timing. Thank you. We didn't work that out, I promise. And then if you have a soccer field, these are some of the areas that you're going to be looking at. And this is what ASTM recommends. And of course, the manufacturers are all part of ASTM. They're part of the group that's coming up with these standards. So they're all aware of these, and they're all going to abide by them. Yes, sir.
Maybe you're already going to mention this one too, but as I understand the ASTM too, they have these 10 points, but they also encourage you as a tester to go seek out areas and add as many additional points as you can.
Right, and this is virtually just the minimum that they would say go out and do. I would say, you know where the wear is on your field, go check those areas out. And it doesn't take long. It's only a few minutes to go out with the infill depth gauge, measure those infill depths. But what it's going to do in the long run, it could ultimately save your company a lot of money. It may delay replacement of that field a couple of years. It may prevent an injury. I mean, we can't be 100% certain, but the better we can make that surface, the less likely an injury is going to occur just from a probability standpoint. Brush the surface, right? So any sort of static brush, y'all don't have the labor force of graduate students that we had, so probably a push broom's not going to work out real well for you. But any sort of drag brush, and drag in multiple directions. So don't always drag the same pattern. You'll end up getting some movement of the infill in areas that you don't want it if you consistently go that same pattern, right? So you want to move it around a little bit. And keep a log of it. Now, I'm telling you to groom the surface, there can be such a thing as too much grooming, right? So we got an abrasive brush. We're dragging it across plastic fibers. There's a chance that if you do too much of it, that you're actually going to start wearing out the fibers. Now, if we're dealing with something like a slit film, it may not be that big of a deal because it's actually the fibers are designed to fray as it is. On a monofilament type, you may actually start wearing down the tips of those fibers. So just be mindful of that, and of course, always follow the manufacturer's recommendations. Check your infill depths, brush, check your infill depths, and don't be afraid to go out there and add some more infill back into it. Every manufacturer has what they consider to be ideal for their system. And they'll tell you, we expect to have this infill depth. Once we install it, this will be the minimum infill depth. And usually it's a certain percentage of the pile height of the actual turf. So just maintain above that. right? So stay just above that minimum, stay at least at the minimum, stay a little bit above, keep it consistent all the way across the surface, and you're going to minimize injury as best you can. You're going to make that surface perform better and last much, much longer. So signs you may need more than just a simple drag, right? Fibers are trapped. Now on that 1.5 or 1.25 surface, we didn't have to really worry about trapped fibers because they were so short and stout to begin with. But if you've got a surface that anything above, say, a 2-inch, 2.5-inch pile height, there's a good chance that if you don't perform maintenance often enough, that those fibers will get bent over and mashed into the infill. In fact, infill may end up over the top of them. That's going to make the surface a little bit less stable. It's bad for the fibers itself. And it can actually increase things like cleat lock because now instead of fibers moving up this way, they're actually bent over sideways. It can interfere with the cleat a little bit more. So that's one good measure of saying we need to do something a little bit more. The surface is firmer than normal. So I showed you on that previous slide that by not doing maintenance, we saw a 20 G increase in surface hardness. Go out there and walk on your field. You don't have to pay the $15,000 to own a F355 A missile or 18 for the E missile. Just go out and walk on it. And walk on it, you can start to feel, is it firmer than normal? Maybe I need to do a little bit more. Is it different? So if I walk over here, is it softer? If I walk over there, same thing with doing like infill areas. When you know you've got some areas that are higher traffic than others, see if you can start noticing differences of how it feels underfoot. And if you do, that may be a good sign that you've got to do a little bit more. Yes, sir.
So going to that point, you mentioned a lot of brushing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you do the decompaction relief annually, or do you use the verdigrum anymore, or do you just brush the car? Because you will, or do you recommend spiking? All those things that were recommended at one time. Annually, you should bring in a verdigrum and really spike it, sweep it, suck it. And now it seems like everybody's just saying brush the car.
Okay. So the question is, do we need to increase maintenance over just brushing? Should we do some of those dethatching type activities to kind of loosen it up? And honestly, there's still a need for some of that. But the better you do at checking your infill levels and maintaining those consistently, the better off you're going to be, and really the less you're going to need that type of activity. But when you start getting to this point, that's where you really got to start bringing in some of those other pieces of equipment. So if you start noticing a lot of debris, a lot of things in that surface, there's a lot of junk that falls off kids and ends up on the field, right? And then if your infill levels get very, very inconsistent, so you're getting proper infill depths over here, but a lot of areas are improper, it may be time to really loosen up that infill material, maybe even remove it and replace it, that sort of thing. So I'm going to give you an example here. This is a field outside of Knoxville. I won't tell you where it is. It's not a Knox County high school. It's not a university field. It's a small field outside of Knoxville, and this is what it looks like. This is for little kids to play soccer on, by the way. This isn't adults. This is little kids to play soccer on. So this is what it looks like. You can see here, just from this picture, I mean, one, you've got a lot of rocks. I didn't just have, I mean, there were rocks everywhere. But you've got a lot of loose fibers. You've also got a lot of bent over fibers, and you really don't have an ample amount of infill material right here. So getting that static broom out and going and brushing this thing really isn't going to do a whole lot, right? It'll move the rocks around. It might pull up a few fibers, but it's not going to do a whole lot. So that's where you really need to get into something that's more comprehensive. And of course, all this information, if you go to the Synthetic Turf Council's website, they have a guide there that can help you decide on what type of maintenance to actually perform. So use some of these different equipment. Some of it can just be as simple as using a tine rake, just to kind of help loosen that infill material up. So if we get a lot of compaction, loosen it up. Come back with a quick brush, check your infill depth levels again, and see if they're back to where they should be. And it can be as much as actually removing all that infill a number of years go by, enough contamination gets in there, it might be worthwhile to remove the actual infill, come back in with new, and replace it. And assuming the fibers are in really good condition, you can almost make that field seem like it's brand new again. So a lot of options out there for doing this type of maintenance. Have your field tested. And there are recommendations on how often you should have it tested. I think I've seen some as, every 2 or every 4 years, or it really depends on the manufacturer. But for a couple $1,000s, it's a nice thing to have someone come out, an actual testing company. Not me. I'm not doing it. So don't call me. I'm not coming to test your field. But call reputable. Not that I'm not reputable, but call an actual company designed to do that. Have them come out and test your field. It provides documentation on how your field is performing, right? So they're going to give you a report. You're going to have that documentation. It's also going to help you understand, what types of maintenance things that you may need to do, or is it getting close to replacement? Yes, sir.
A couple of questions. One, why don't you do it? And two, why is it so hard to find a company?
That's a really good question. There are only a handful of companies that really do it, and the majority of them focus a lot of their time in Europe. Now, this is a big deal in European fields. In fact, testing is built into the price of the field. They expect that field to maintain, to be exactly what it is when it's installed through the course of the life. It's just something that hasn't translated in the U.S. market yet, right? And legality. Somebody hasn't sued somebody yet, so to make it. And on one side, you don't want to know. Oh, it's extremely high liability. But those guys, they're comparable equipment. They do a really good job. It's worthwhile to do it. I would rather know. And in fact, this is that field that I showed you the picture of. This is the field that we're actually doing the testing on. That's Kylie Dixon, and then that's myself doing this testing. The owner of the field, we were asked by a concerned parent to go out and test it. The owner of the field didn't really know. The soccer coach knew we were out there testing. The owner of the field didn't really know. I'm sure you got quite a shock when you got the report back. And so here's Synthetic Turf's guidelines of what type of performance you should, what type of testing should be done, what kind of performance characteristics there are, and they differentiate between stadium and community field. One important thing here, this is below 165. It's ASTM standard for surface hardness. So if we use that A missile, that big flat one, it should be under 165. Here's what they recommend for getting your field tested, right? So a community field every 4 years, stadium field every year. I really like STC has done a really good job on a lot of things. This is the one thing I would strongly disagree with. I think this is more important here than it is here. How much use is that community field getting? How much inputs are being put into it? So that's really I think a big problem that community field should really get a little more love and be tested more often, because we're dealing with small children, not big monsters, right? So here's that same field, and unfortunately it's I don't know if you can see it or not, but that says 148. So this field is over a decade old, has never had any maintenance on it. Lots of kids play on it regularly all day long playing soccer and stuff like that. Still measured 148. So that might be a problem. No, it's just a standard SBR. Yep. That's with the 355. Yep. So 148. What? Oh no, Lord no. They hardly had gravel. Well, they had gravel. You could feel it. It was a wave. So here's the test results from that field. Right, so we've got the 1292, that's the E missile, the F355 A, so that's a hemispherical, and we're looking at head injury criteria. And we start looking at these numbers over here. That's not safe enough for my 2-year-old to fall over on, according to that data. So and this is from a 1.3 meter. So if we talk to World Rugby, they're going to specify that at 1.3 meter on a synthetic surface, it has to be below 1,000 or they won't play on it. And that field has to maintain that for the life of the field if you want to be certified for World Rugby. That's not even remotely close to 1,000. And we'll look at kind of what the injury is. And then here's the F355 A missile, and we average out at 156. We had a couple places that were above that 165. We ended up at 156. So based on that A missile data, we actually passed the standard by not doing maintenance for, I think, 14 years. So I don't know. So I think there should be some visitation back to that, but of course that's for others to work at. And this is that curve, the injury curve that we look at for head injury criteria. So that E-missile was initially designed to be tested on playgrounds. So right, they could drop it from whatever height a kid might fall off the swing set and see what that surface is and how likely they're going to injure themselves. And what we're looking at here is we start getting over in this kind of range. We're not looking at concussion, we're looking at skull fractures, right? And things like death. Not that important. A skull fracture, you can walk that off, right? So if we're in that 2,400 range, we're up in somewhere like, I don't know, what about 75% probability of death based on this injury curve? So I don't know. There's some discrepancy there. So I'm telling you, get your field tested to have that information, but also think you should interpret it yourself and decide whether things are safe or not. The unfortunate side is, according to ASTM, using the head injury criteria is not part of synthetic turf testing. So I'm not preaching for or against it. I'm just telling you what it is. So here's some summaries. The biggest take-home message: always follow your installer manufacturer's guide to perform your maintenance so that you adhere to your warranty and don't sue me for anything that I told you and you think is 100% correct. I'm a researcher. We make mistakes occasionally. So most important, I think, that you can take home from this is maintain your infill depth levels. You do that, you're going to be in really good shape. You're going to be well ahead of anybody else. There's the actual manuals that you can go to that I pulled some of the information from.